Reading the Times for Friday, February 14th, 2020. Barr says attacks from Trump make work impossible. Mr. Barr's remarks were aimed at containing the fallout from the department's botched handling of its sentencing recommendation for Mr. Trump's longtime friend Roger J. Stone Jr., who was convicted of 7 felonies in a bid to obstruct a congressional investigation that threatened the president. Mr. Trump compared the Stone case to the Russia investigation led by the special counsel Robert S. Mueller III. Even Bob Mueller lied to Congress, Mr. Trump said, without evidence. Mr. Barr quickly became one of Mr. Trump's trusted advisors after becoming Attorney General last February, a reversal of the tense relationship that Mr. Trump had with Mr. Barr's predecessor, Jeff Sessions. China expands chaotic dragnet in coronavirus crackdown. First announced last week in the city of Wuhan, already has been marred by chaotic conditions that have isolated vulnerable patients without adequate care and in some cases left them alone to die. In their zeal to execute the edict, officials in Wuhan, a metropolis of 11 million, have haphazardly seized patients who have not yet tested positive for the coronavirus, in some cases herding them onto buses with no protective measures where they risked infection from others, the relatives said. Some confirmed cases with serious symptoms have been transferred to 2 newly built hospitals dedicated to treating coronavirus patients. How months of miscalculation led the U.S. and Iran to the brink of war. What happened over the past several months, based on interviews with officials from the United States, Iran, and other Middle Eastern countries, as well as outside analysts, is a story of miscalculations by both sides and of violence that spilled into nations across the Middle East, from Syria to Saudi Arabia to Iraq. The Trump administration escalated a campaign of financial warfare, so-called maximum pressure, to suffocate Iran's economy in hopes of forcing its government back into negotiations over its nuclear program and its military operations throughout the region. Israel's Mossad intelligence service delivered a stark warning to officials in Washington about potential attacks by Iran or Shiite militia groups it supports, both on American forces in Iraq and against Arab states hostile to Iran, namely Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. Several times last year, Britain's ambassador to Iran, Robert McClatchy, a public critic of the American policy, traveled to Washington to meet with American intelligence officials and diplomats to give an assessment of the view of leaders in Iran. Even some former Trump administration officials said that the White House's position betrayed a misunderstanding of Iran's leadership, born from a paucity of intelligence and direct contact with Tehran. Biden needs black voters to lift his campaign, but he has competition. Even before the final results from New Hampshire showed former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. finishing a distant 5th, Mr. Biden had flown to the warm embrace of South Carolina on Tuesday night, appearing at a party that had all the markings of a victory celebration. Mr. Biden's campaign, in turn, is making clear that South Carolina counts. Even as they face a financial strain following his lackluster early performances, Biden officials are pouring money into a state that they hope can revive his candidacy. One of the up-and-comers, Mr. Moore, ticked off a list of what he views as blemishes on Mr. Biden's record that should be barriers for black voters. Mr. Biden's past support for crime bills that some experts argue resulted in harsh sentences for black offenders, his treatment of Anita Hill during Clarence Thomas's Supreme Court confirmation hearings, and his eulogy for Strom Thurmond, the state's one-time Dixiecrat senator. The Bloomberg campaign is a waterfall of cash. While Senator Bernie Sanders, leading progressive, has emerged as a front-runner in an exceedingly tight race. Former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. has faltered, and several other candidates have splintered the moderate vote that Mr. Bloomby hopes to capture in the Super Tuesday contest on March 3rd. In the first quarter of his campaign alone, Mr. Bloomby, who was not accepting political donations, spent $188 million, more than what numerous candidates in the race had spent combined. And don't get me wrong, I like Mike Bloomby, said Raymond Vivas, who attended Mr. Bloomby's Miami rally in January and wore one of the free t-shirts bearing that message, along with 2 Bloomby buttons. Day to day, some Bloomby campaign workers with prior political experience who requested anonymity because they were not authorized to speak about the work for Mr. Bloomby described what they saw as an unfathomable luxury, the ability to brainstorm and act on their ideas without concern for cost. Playing on Kansas City radio, Russian propaganda. In January, Radio Sputnik, a propaganda arm of the Russian government, started broadcasting on 3 Kansas City area radio stations during prime drive times, even sharing one frequency with a station rooted in the city's historic jazz district. Peter Schartel, the owner of Alpine Broadcasting Corporation of Liberty, Missouri, the company airing Sputnik in Kansas City, said he started the broadcast on January 1st, both because he liked what he heard during a trial run last fall, and because he was getting paid. Anyone tuned into Sputnik on 104.7 FM while driving across the historic 18th and Vine District in Kansas City, Missouri, will find that it fades for a few minutes of music from KOJH, the call letters referring to Kansas City's oldest jazz house, before Sputnik takes back over. Bong Joon-ho's path from Seoul to Oscar dominance. Eom Han-ki's pizza parlor in the rundown Noryangjin district of Seoul has attracted unusual customers in recent months, movie fans from Japan and even the United States and Argentina all coming to pay homage at one of the locations where Bong Joon-ho shot Parasite. As South Korea began democratizing in the 1990s, phasing out state censorship of movies and books, a new generation of film directors and producers like Mr. Bong and Mr. Cha, who had lived through the turmoil of the 1980s as students, spawned a renaissance in the South Korean movie industry at the beginning of the new millennium. Even after Parasite won the prestigious Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival in May, a first for a South Korean movie, many conservative politicians sneered at Mr. Bong, calling his latest film a commie flick, not worth watching. Sudan says it agrees to compensate families of USS Cole bombing. Sudan's interim government said on Thursday it had reached a financial settlement with families of victims of the attack on the USS Cole in Yemen, an effort to persuade the United States to remove Sudan from a list of state sponsors of terrorism. Sudan's interim government said in a statement announcing the settlement on Thursday, "It is not responsible for the act or any other acts of terrorism." It said Sudan is offering the compensation only in order to meet the prerequisites set by the American embassy for removing the name of Sudan from the list of state sponsors of international terrorism, so the relations with the United States of America and the rest of the world can be normalized. American officials have pressed Sudan for reparations in recent months, the State Department said, saying compensation for the victims of terrorism remained a priority if the United States was to remove Sudan from the list. A U.S. Taliban deal hinges on reducing violence. It might work like this. If the sides do succeed in observing a period of reduced hostilities, the next steps of the deal will fall into place. First, a formal signing between the United States and the Taliban that rolls out a schedule for gradual withdrawal of the remaining American troops, and then the start of negotiations between the Taliban and Afghan leaders over the political future of the country. Afghan officials say they stood down for 2 days, and then Taliban started launching attacks. Afghan officials seem reluctant to give away that leverage so early in their talks before they have secured Taliban commitments on basic issues. Celebrated abroad, Juan Guaido faces critical test. in Venezuela. Moments before Mr. Guaido arrived, Mr. Maduro's supporters attacked journalists who were there to cover his arrival, punching them and dragging at least one woman by the hair. Mr. Guaido issued a direct challenge to Mr. Maduro a year ago when he pointed to irregularities in Mr. Maduro's re-election and claimed to be the country's interim president, earning the support of millions of Venezuelans and dozens of foreign governments, including the United States. Despite the United States' use of crippling sanctions to hurt the country's economy and try to force the ouster of Mr. Maduro, Mr. Guaido has not managed to seize power and call new presidential elections, his stated goal. U.S. faces tough great game against China in Central Asia and beyond. The State Department released a Central Asia strategy document on February 5th that said the top priority was to support and strengthen the sovereignty and independence of the Central Asian states, a reference to warding off the influence of China and Russia. Mr. Pompeo made London his first stop on a recent 6-day trip to Europe and Central Asia, and he said there on January 30th that the Chinese Communist Party was the central threat to our times. The next day, he spoke about China with leaders in Ukraine. To wit, the Secretary of State just made the first visit by America's top diplomat to Central Asia in 5 years. 5! But spent a hefty chunk of it talking about China, he wrote on Twitter. Sajid Javid, UK finance chief, quits as Boris Johnson shuffles team. What was expected to be a routine cabinet reshuffle by Prime Minister Boris Johnson took an extraordinary turn on Thursday when the Treasury Chief, Sajid Javid, abruptly resigned rather than cede some of his power over economic policy to Mr. Johnson. The surprise departure of such a senior figure was a significant blow to Mr. Johnson. The Treasury is traditionally the most powerful department in the British government, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who leads it, is usually the second most important politician after the Prime Minister. Esther McVey, the House Minister, made it clear that she would have liked to remain in the position, but said Mr. Johnson would have her support from the backbenches as a lawmaker without a government ministry. How Dresden looked after World War II firestorms, 75 years later. Germans on Thursday marked 75 years since Allied bombs destroyed the eastern city of Dresden, with national leaders emphasizing atonement and the universal mourning of the war's victims, even as the far right has promoted a revisionist view of the Nazi state. After German reunification in the 1990s, historians and researchers determined that about 25,000 people perished in the attack, a number in line with the fatalities in other German cities targeted by American and British bombardiers in the final days of the war. Mr. Steinmeier urged Germans to push back against efforts to contradict or play down their country's responsibility for the crimes of World War II. Whoever pits the dead of Dresden against the dead of Auschwitz, whoever seeks to talk down German wrongs, whoever falsifies improved knowledge and historical facts, he said, we as Democrats must loudly and clearly contradict them. We must defy them. As passenger angst grows, Japan to let some off ship, but fewer than hoped. Japan's health minister said a few categories of passengers could spend the remainder of the 2-week quarantine ashore. Passengers were growing concerned that the longer they stayed on board, the longer the quarantine could be extended for passengers who were potentially exposed to confirmed infections. Ms. Montgomery suggested that the governments of the countries with passengers or crew members on the Diamond Princess should offer to house people in quarantine facilities on land. As virus titans grip on China, the art world feels a squeeze. A major art fair in Hong Kong was called off, and important spring art auctions half a world away in New York have been postponed because well-heeled Chinese buyers may find it difficult to travel to them. Last week, Art Basel Hong Kong, an annual art fair scheduled for mid-March, was cancelled, depriving dealers and artists of a major opportunity to show works to customers based in China and beyond. The auctions held every March at Christie's, Sotheby's, and elsewhere in New York City have been postponed until June. The virus comes at a particularly difficult time because any art that originated in China has been subject to a 15% tariff for months as a result of President Dumbass's trade standoff with Beijing, which means it is now harder not only for dealers to sell art, but also to buy it. As an American in a lockdown Chinese town, everyone here is so bored. One day, a guard paused to look at Mr. Huang's passport, then look up and scowled. Another guard told Mr. Huang that he saw a memo from the same lab which had been posted online. One day, a drunk neighbor returned to Mr. Huang's complex and refused to explain why he had been gone for more than a day. How the coronavirus numbers changed so sharply. Previously, cases were counted only if patients tested positive for the new virus. WHO has formally requested additional information on the clinically diagnosed cases, in particular when those had occurred in the course of the outbreak, and whether suspect cases were reclassified as clinically diagnosed cases. In any case, it can take days or weeks before a patient tests positive for antibodies to a new infection, so the test may not be useful in diagnosing current illnesses. China ousts 2 party officials amid outrage about coronavirus. China's leader Xi Jinping summarily ousted 2 top Communist Party officials from the province at the center of the coronavirus epidemic on Thursday, exacting political punishment for the regional government's handling of a crisis that seemed far from under control. The reshuffling of the party leadership in the province, Hubei, and its capital, Wuhan, reflect an aggressive effort by Mr. Xi to contain not only the political and economic damage of the epidemic, but also any simmering public anger among millions of people locked down for more than 3 weeks. The party had only moved against the party secretary and the director of Hubei's provincial health commission, who were both replaced this week. It didn't work. States that ended parole for violent crime are thinking again. Still, analysts say recent attempts to restore parole in California, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere were beaten back amid political pressure on lawmakers over concerns that someone released on parole could commit a serious violent crime. Even after Virginia lawmakers abolished many forms of parole in the 1990s, some types of it remained available, including the possibility of parole for prisoners older than 61 and for inmates arrested before January 1st, 1995. Gone for new inmates was the sort of parole most inmates had previously been released on. On parole, offenders are generally allowed to serve the remainder of their sentence outside of prison with stipulations that they meet regularly with a parole officer, stay employed, get counseling, and pass drug and alcohol tests. Oklahoma botched 2 executions. It says it's ready to try again. Oklahoma plans to resume putting inmates to death using lethal injection drugs, 5 years after officials halted all executions in the wake of a series of botched procedures that drew national attention to the state's death penalty protocol. Later in 2015, Richard E. Glossip, a death row inmate who challenged the constitutionality of Oklahoma's lethal injection protocol before the Supreme Court, was granted a stay of execution after the state's supplier of lethal injection drugs sent prison officials the wrong drug. Until we have a complete confidence in the system, we will delay any further executions, the Republican governor at the time, Mary Fallin, said in 2015. The decision was later backed by a federal judge in Oklahoma, who ordered the state to stop executions until the protocol was revised. House votes to extend deadline to ratify Equal Rights Amendment. Republican opponents argued the amendment is unnecessary because the 14th Amendment already guarantees equal treatment for all citizens under the law. The Equal Rights Amendment is nothing to do about equal rights and everything about abortion. That's why they call it the Everything Related to Abortion Act, the group said on its website. The text of the Equal Rights Amendment is simple. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. It was first proposed in 1923 by Alice Paul, a leader of the suffrage movement. The Andrew Yang exit interview. There are people who put months and months into making you successful, and then you have to pull the rug out from under them, under the campaign, in a snap second. Certainly, people have been reaching out with various questions about the future, which is invigorating. The one big difference between Nevada and Iowa is that Nevada has early caucuses, where essentially people will show up at roughly 80 sites around the state and rank their preferences, and then leave. North Dakota tribes score key voting rights victory. North Dakota officials have reached a settlement with 2 Native American tribes over the state's restrictive voter identification laws. Many Native American reservations do not use traditional addresses, and the law, which Republican-controlled North Dakota legislature passed shortly after a Democrat, Heidi Heitkamp, won a close Senate race in 2012 with a strong support from Native Americans, meant that they could not vote with an ID that listed a post office box as an address. The co-executive director of 4 Directions, a Native American voting rights group that has worked with tribal leaders in response to the voter ID law, sounded buoyant in an interview on a Thursday. The Nevada caucuses are up next. Will they unfold smoothly? More than a week later, with the early caucusing set to begin on Saturday before the February 22nd contest, presidential campaigns are growing increasingly anxious over an urgent question. How does Nevada plan to avoid Iowa's fate? The Nevada Democrats have been set to use Shadow, the same app technology that Iowa had relied on to tabulate and report the results, and the state party had paid roughly $60,000 for the contract. In most ways, the caucuses in Nevada work as they do in Iowa, and Democratic officials have emphasized the ease of the process. You show up at your local precinct, often a nearby school or community center. Find the sign with your chosen candidate and wait a few minutes to hear whether your candidate is viable. Caucus. Speak for having at least 15% of all support in the precinct. The math that could add up to a Sanders nomination. Rather than winnow the field, Iowa and New Hampshire elevated the candidates who have been in 5th and 6th places in national polls. Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar. His vast financial resources and status as a well-known returning runner-up give him some sort of advantages that establishment-backed candidates have usually relied on to outlast activist-backed candidates. Even if 3 candidates get over 15% nationwide, the real key is whether 3 candidates will be over 15% in every state, as at least 3 candidates were in every state in the Republican contest on Super Tuesday in 2016. Bloomberg once linked 2008 crisis to end of redlining bias in home loans. Michael R. Bloomberg, the Democratic presidential candidate and former mayor of New York City, drew criticism on Thursday over newly surfaced comments from the height of the 2008 financial crisis, in which he said that the end of redlining, a discriminatory housing practice, had helped contribute to the economic collapse. Racial justice advocates also criticized Mr. Bloomberg's description of redlining as a policy against poor people, as opposed to a policy against people of color. Mr. Loiser, the Bloomberg spokesman, said in his statement on Thursday after the redlining comments emerged, "Because he knows how important it is to keep people in their homes, Mike attacked predatory lending as mayor and helped other cities craft innovative strategies to reduce evictions as a philanthropist, and Mike has detailed plans for how he will help 1 million more black families buy a house and counteract the effects of redlining and the subprime mortgage crisis as a president." Justice Department is investigating CIA resistance to sharing Russia secrets. Officials from the FBI and the National Security Agency have told Mr. Durham and his investigators that such an interpretation is wrong and based on a misunderstanding of how the intelligence community functions. The people said Mr. Durham has interviewed FBI officials and agents who worked on a bureau's Russia investigation called Crossfire Hurricane, and for the special counsel who took over the inquiry, Robert S. Mueller III. They have also interviewed CIA analyst Mr. Durham has requested Mr. Brennan's emails, call logs, and other documents from the CIA to learn what he told other officials, including Mr. Comey, about his and the CIA's views of a notorious dossier of assertions about Russia and Trump associates. In bipartisan bid to restrain Trump, Senate passes Iran war powers a resolution. The Senate voted on Thursday to require President Trump to seek congressional authorization before taking further military action against Iran, as Democrats joined forces with 8 Republicans to try to rein in the president's war-making powers weeks after he escalated hostilities with Tehran. The statement described the measures as grounded in a faulty premise because the United States was not currently engaged in any use of force against Iran. In the Senate, Republicans mirrored Mr. Trump's language, arguing that the resolution would shackle the president to a potentially perilous time and be viewed by Tehran as a message of weakness. Last year, Congress cleared a bipartisan measure invoking the War Powers Act that would cut off American military support for the Saudi-led campaign in Yemen's civil war, and a separate measure seeking to curtail the president's war-making power in the Iran ping-pong between the two chambers, passing the House, but not the Senate. Trump places loyalists in key jobs inside the White House while raging against enemies outside. John F. Kelly, the former White House Chief of Staff, expressed support for one of the key impeachment witnesses whom President Trump abruptly fired last week, drawing swift response from the president, who tweeted Thursday morning that Mr. Kelly misses the action and just can't keep his mouth shut. Mr. Kelly said in a speech Wednesday evening that Lieutenant Colonel Alexander S. Vindman, an expert on Ukraine from the National Security Council, removed from his post last week, was right to raise questions about a telephone call with the president of Ukraine in which Mr. Trump pressured for investigations for his political rivals. Mr. Trump raised the question of a biased juror in the trial a day after the judge overseeing the Stone proceedings, Judge Amy Berman Jackson of the U.S. District Court in Washington, ruled against a previously sealed motion from Mr. Stone that claimed a different juror was biased and therefore he deserved a new trial. $2.6 million for Puerto Rico's pension fund went to hackers instead. As if Puerto Ricans needed another reason to worry about where their tax money was going, a senior official told the police on Wednesday that the island's government had unwittingly handed over $2.6 million to thieves after being fooled by a bogus email message. Osvaldo Soto, the island's public affairs secretary, said the government had been working with federal law enforcement agencies, as well as those on the island since January 23rd, to investigate the frauds, which he said had also affected the island's Roads and Transportation Authority and Commerce and Export agencies. Any embezzlement is the government's fault. I heard that the government assured that the pensions will not be affected by this, but right now the people have very little confidence in the government institutions. Trump's path to weaker fuel efficiency rules may lead to a dead end. For months, Trump administration aides crunching the numbers of the new rule have come up with the same unwelcoming result. While lower sticker prices on less fuel-efficient cars would save consumer money up front, fuel cost over time would overwhelm the initial savings. From the beginning of his administration, Mr. Trump saw the fuel economy rules as an opportunity. A draft of the rules sent to the White House in January concluded that the Trump fuel economy target would lower new car and light truck prices by about $1,000, but would increase the amount consumers would pay for gasoline by about $1,400, according to people who have seen the documents. Administration to divert billions from Pentagon to fund the border wall. The Pentagon plans to divert $3.8 billion intended for military equipment to the construction of a wall on the southwestern border. It informed lawmakers on Thursday, drawing bipartisan outrage and reviving a long-running battle with Congress over funding for President Trump's signature campaign promise. The Pentagon funds are critical to Mr. Trump's mandate to build 450 miles of border walls by 2021, particularly because Congress has allocated only a fraction of what the president has demanded for the project, $1.375 billion for the 2020 fiscal year, which ends September 30th. Mr. Trump has gained access to additional funds, in part because of his national emergency declaration and in part by using authority to divert funds within the department. Former clerk alleges sexual harassment by appellate judge. Detailing her experience working for Judge Reinhardt in 2017 and 18, Olivia Warren, the former clerk, testified before a subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee that Judge Reinhardt openly commented on his female clerk's physical appearances and on her sexual relationship with her spouse. In her testimony, Ms. Warren described Judge Reinhardt as hostile to the #MeToo movement and always casting doubt upon allegations of sexual misconduct based on his belief that women were liars who could not be trusted. The bombshell alleged that against Judge Kozinski became a regular focal point of our lunches and broader discussions with the judge, which often tended toward the graphic and profane, Ms. Warren said, and added that Judge Reinhardt told her that he intended to publicly confront one of Judge Kozinski's accusers. Veterans Affair, a Trump signature issue, is facing turmoil again. Leaders of Concerned Veterans for America, like many current and former Veterans Department officials, fear the problems could presage the return to a dark era, when inattention to veterans' health care led to scandals and tragedies. Last fall, Andrea Goldstein, a Navy veteran and the senior policy advisor for Women's Veteran Task Force on the House Veterans Affairs Committee, told the New York Times that she was assaulted while buying a snack at the medical center's cafeteria in Washington. "The general sense is outrage," said Kristen L. Rouse, the founder of the NYC Veterans Alliance, who, like many female veterans, has received an outpouring of emails and calls from other female veterans who said they had experiences similar to Miss Goldstein's. Love letter from World War II reveal promises made and broken. Love letters from the war have been found in second-hand shops by house clearing companies and on eBay, where they are priced as high as $500. Through the families of World War II veterans, the museum collected the letters to sweethearts, family members, and friends. Her answer is a mystery, because the museum does not have the letters Mr. Upcraft received from her. Mr. Upcraft's letters were donated to the museum more than 12 years ago by Miss Russo's family. Mike Bloomberg is hacking your attention. Mike Bloomberg and his presidential campaign respects the fundamental equation governing the modern internet: shamelessness and conflict equal attention. These extremely online tactics fit the larger ethos of the Bloomberg campaign, which feels like a control group experiment for a study positing, what if you ran a presidential campaign so optimized for efficiency and reach that you cut out the human element of campaigning altogether? As my newsroom colleague Matt Flegerheimer wrote in January, Mr. Bloomberg is not really playing chess. He's more accurately working to bury the board with a gusher of cash, so overpowering that everyone forgets how the game was always played in the first place. After news broke that the president mocked Mr. Bloomberg's height in a Super Bowl interview with Sean Hannity, the Bloomberg campaign spokeswoman, Julie Wood, fired back with a Trumpian line of her own. "The president is lying. He's a pathological liar who lies about everything: his fake hair, his obesity, and his spray-on tan." Bernie Sanders isn't a socialist. He's basically what Europeans would call a social democrat, and social democrats, like social democracies like Denmark, are quite nice places to live with societies that are freer than our own. Where Sanders is playing right into one disreputable Republican political strategy, Buttigieg is playing into another, the strategy of hobbling the economy with fiscal austerity when a Democrat occupies the White House, then borrowing freely as soon as the GOP regains power. So Democrats have a perfect opportunity to portray themselves truthfully as the defenders of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the now popular Affordable Care Act against Republicans who are more or less nakedly favoring the interest of plutocrats over those of working families. This is how Scandinavia got great. Fuck David Brooks. Bildung is devised to change the way students see the world. The purpose of Bildung is to help people move through the uncomfortable transitions between each way of seeing. If you have a thin educational system that does not help students see the webs of significance between people, does not even help students see how they see, then you're going to wind up with a society in which people can't see through each other's lens. I didn't know my father until I read his love letters to my mother. You're in my mind so much, I can't think of anything else. I want you to believe me, because I love you. You probably know that by now, but I'm not sure whether you love me. The reason I say that is because of the last letter. I don't have to repeat it because you're the one who wrote the letter. The letter is intricately folded into a tight rectangle, and I can just picture my young father taking the time to fold it and fold it again and again, placing it in a small envelope and sending it off to the love of his life. The Times is committed to publishing a diversity of letters to the editor. The Parkland Massacre isn't an anniversary. Who, as well-meaning people sometimes do, would issue a trigger warning to survivors of gun violence, or advise me to give my best shot at telling Galen's story, or even ask me if I'm willing to share it. I'm always happy to help, but that kindly locution gives me pause. 100 people are killed by guns each day in America, and it's business as usual. The ugly fact is that gun violence can happen wherever there are guns, and guns are everywhere. There are nearly 400 million civilian-owned guns in the country. They're not going away. Is Bloomby the Democrats' best hope? From my point of view, Mr. Bloomby is right on the social issues that Mr. Friedman cites, and most knowledgeable on business issues, budgets, and how to run a major big organization like our government. If Democrats truly mean it when they say they will vote for anyone, Mickey Mouse, anyone who can beat Mr. Trump, they better hop on the Bloomby bandwagon because he's the only game in town. Mr. Bloomby, the moderate, pragmatic, results-oriented individual who actually built a successful business himself, but is aging and lacks experience with Congress. Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop Arts and Science. In closing the court of history, Matthew Connolly expresses concern about records deleted within federal agencies after a set time instead of being transferred into the National Archives and Records Administration. Having worked on-site with officials in federal agencies early in my NARA career to appraise paper records for the transfer into the National Archives, I know that some 3% of federal records warrant designation as historical. I've worked on several moves of White House records to NARA, since some 90 to 95% of President Barack Obama's presidential records were born digital. He and NARA agree there is no need to reconstruct a separate presidential library building. Is this New York City's nicest public bathroom? An informal look at the subway bathroom last year by the New York Times found that 51 of the 472 stations had working bathrooms. Now the bathroom outside the PATH station has raised the bar for commuter bathrooms even more. The Greeley Square bathroom, though smaller than Bryant Park's, costs more than twice as much to fix up because of plumbing, electrical, and construction challenges of a bathroom in a curbside kiosk above subway and train lines. Weinstein's lawyer says accusers had a choice in sexual encounters. During a 5-hour closing argument, the lawyer, Donna Rotuno, argued that Mr. Weinstein's accusers had chosen to engage in consensual and often transactional relationships with him to advance their own careers. Ms. Rotuno said prosecutors from Manhattan District Attorney's Office had woven a sinister tale during Mr. Weinstein's rape trial, depicting him as a monster and his accusers as innocent passive victims. Each time Miss Mann got a new telephone number, Ms. Rotuno noted, she made sure Mr. Weinstein had it. The bail reform backlash that has Democrats at war. These are some of the images and incidents that have been used in what has become one of New York's most divisive political battles in years, a bitter, often racially tinged debate over the state's new bail and discovery laws. For reformers, as changes to the bail law were long overdue and deeply important. The new law would mean that thousands of people in jail awaiting trial would be released, allowing them to return home, safeguard jobs and families, and maintain stability in communities decimated by decades of incarceration. New Yorkers United for Justice, a coalition behind the Long Island ad, had spent more than $2 million to pass and defend the changes to the bail law, hiring A-list publicists, an Albany lobbyist, and investing in polling, media training, and a rapid response war room, which bombards journalists and elected officials on Twitter and through emails after sensitive articles appear. She pulled rank to avoid a $50 ticket. Now she'll pay a $5,000 fine. Deputy Inspector Catalina instructed the desk officer at the precinct to tell Officer Hernandez not to issue a ticket, Miss Gibson said. The deputy chief told the police officer that I was head of Public Safety Committee and asked the police officer to admonish me instead of issuing a summons, Miss Gibson acknowledged in a settlement announced Thursday by the Conflicts of Interest Board. After pulling Miss Gibson over, Officer Hernandez says she received numerous messages over the radio to call in to her commanding officers. U.S. charges Huawei with racketeering, adding pressure on China. The U.S. government has charged Huawei and two of its subsidiaries with federal racketeering and conspiracy to steal trade secrets from American companies, a significant escalation of the Trump administration's legal fight with a Chinese telecommunications company. In a federal indictment unsealed on Thursday, the Department of Justice accused Huawei and its affiliates of a pattern of racketeering activity and said the companies had worked to steal trade secrets from 6 unidentified American firms. Apple. The new charges in the case relate to the alleged decades-long efforts by Huawei and several of its subsidiaries, both in the U.S. and the People's Republic of China, to misappropriate intellectual property, including from 6 U.S. technology companies, Apple, in an effort to grow and operate Huawei's business, the Justice Department said in a news release. Iran's economy is bleak. Its stock market is soaring. Mr. Wojtal, who runs an investment fund devoted to Iranian stocks, identified a company that was poised to benefit. Gorgi Biscuit was well positioned to raise prices, given the foreign competitors were forced to steer clear of Iran because of American sanctions that restricted commerce with the country. Sanctions have barred sales of Iranian oil, a major source of revenue for the Iranian government, though unknown volumes continue to be smuggled out of the country. Ordinary Iranians race to exchange the domestic currency, the rial, into dollars, pushing its value down by 70% in 2018. For Iranian exporters, a weak currency was good news. Judge halts work on Microsoft's Jedi contract, a victory for Amazon. A federal judge in Washington ordered Microsoft on Thursday to halt all work on a $10 billion cloud computing contract for the Pentagon, in a victory for Amazon, which has challenged the awarding of the contract. The decisions add to the acrimony surrounding the contract, which has set off a showdown among Amazon, Microsoft, and other technology companies for the right to transform the military's cloud computing systems. Amazon, which is considered the largest provider of such technology, has been considered a frontrunner to win the contract. Had been considered. McClatchy, a major U.S. paper chain, files for bankruptcy. In a Chapter 11 filing in New York on Thursday, McClatchy, one of the largest news publishers in the United States, said it planned to restructure its pension obligations and address more than $700 million in debt. Ken Doctor, a news media analyst, said Chapin Asset Management's role in the post-bankruptcy McClatchy represented a significant shift in the American news business. John Schluss, the president of News Guild, the union that represents journalists at 6 McClatchy newspapers, said in a statement on Thursday, "A continued financialization of local news will destroy our democracy. It's time for communities across America to stand up and fight to save the local news." Judy Shelton, Trump's Fed nominee, faces bipartisan skepticism. Republican lawmakers expressed concern about Judy Shelton, President Trump's nominee for the Federal Reserve, casting doubt on the confirmation chances of a candidate viewed as potentially the next Fed chair. Ms. Shelton faced skepticism from both Republicans and Democrats on the Senate Banking Committee, with lawmakers questioning whether she would protect the Fed independence and pressing her about previous policy positions she had espoused, including a return to the gold standard. Ms. Shelton's ties to Mr. Trump have become an issue, in part because of the president's vocal criticism of the Fed, which is independent and answers to Congress, not the White House. Experiment shows conservatives more willing to share wealth than they say. American conservatives are more likely than any other major political group in the world to agree with explanations for the inequality suggesting the rich deserve to be richer. They're unlikely to agree with statements suggesting that the rich are richer for reasons unrelated to merit. Supporters of Rwanda's president, Paul Kagame, were the only group whose explanations for inequality favored the rich as much as did those of American Trump supporters. Barclays CEO faces UK inquiry on Jeffrey Epstein ties. Barclays said on Thursday that regulators were investigating how its chief executive, James E. Stolley, had described to bank officials his ties with Mr. Epstein, the financier who killed himself in August after facing new allegations of sex trafficking of underage girls. The bank's announcement of an investigation by regulators, including the Financial Conduct Authority, the main overseer of banks in Britain, was another black eye for Mr. Staley, who is the latest Barclays chief to have regulatory troubles. In a statement, Barclays said it believes that Mr. Staley has been sufficiently transparent with the company as regards to the nature and extent of his relationship with Mr. Epstein. Mr. Staley, the bank said, retained the full confidence of its board. With harsh words, China's military denies it hacked Equifax. China's military on Thursday denied the accusations that it hacked Equifax, one of the largest credit reporting companies in the United States. The United States has increasingly stopped Chinese investors from taking stakes in companies in sensitive industries, and it has warned American allies not to use equipment made by Huawei, the Chinese maker of telecommunications gear. In the statement, Mr. Wu mentioned revelation from WikiLeaks and the former National Security Agency contractor Edward Snowden that showed the United States had targeted China with cyber attacks. High-tech tires from pit lane to your garage. Pirelli is planning to offer performance car owners in the United States an aftermarket cockpit-mounted device that, paired with the sensors in the company's high-end Trofeo tires, can communicate information about tire condition, lap timing, and track positioning. At the moment, plans for the cyber tire in racing environments are vague, although it would seem that Formula One cars would be the ideal testbed. Such an arrangement is not unusual. Michelin supplies tires for all teams in Formula E electric car race series, and the company is working with a tire sensor for those cars that monitor air pressure. As Boeing jets sit idle, Airbus can't make planes fast enough. The troubles plaguing Boeing after the year-long grounding of its 737 MAX plane have created an unusual opening for its chief rival, Airbus, to swoop in and grab business. In the year since Boeing's most important plane was grounded after 2 deadly crashes killed 346 people, orders for the MAX have dried up, and Boeing has been unable to deliver the roughly 400 MAX planes it built since the grounding began in March. For these sorts of flights, airliners prefer to use planes from the Airbus A320 family or the Boeing 737 MAX 8, and at the moment, all orders are for Airbus A320 type planes, Mr. Abulifaya said. Tesla faces a new SEC investigation. The SEC had previously investigated statements from Elon Musk, Tesla's chief executive, about plans to take the company private. Larry Ellison, a Tesla board member, plans to buy up to $1 million. Since Tesla announced its fourth quarter earnings late last month, its share price has risen nearly 40%, giving it a market value of about $145 billion. And that has been Reading the Times for Friday, February 14th, 2020.